You often hear this advice: don't study two similar languages at the same time. You'll just confuse them. And in many cases, that's actually good advice. But there's an important exception, one that completely changes the picture. If you already know one of the languages sufficiently well, studying a related language through it can be remarkably effective. In my own experience, it didn't create confusion. It actually prevented it. I discovered this as a university student from 18 years old in Bogota, Colombia. Spanish had already become a strong working language for me academically and socially. While studying there, I began learning French, German, and Portuguese, all through Spanish. When I studied Portuguese, something unexpected happened. Spanish didn't interfere. It became a reference system. Shared structures were recognized consciously. Differences stood out more clearly, and Portuguese developed its own identity in my mind. That experience shaped how I have approached learning languages for the last 52 years. So, what is the core principle? Here's the key idea that guides everything else in this video. Similarity causes confusion when both languages are weak. When one language is strong, similarity creates contrast, not chaos. With that in mind, here are 9 principles that make learning multiple languages at once not only possible, but effective. Motivation must be emotional, not abstract. And memory science explains why. Languages last when they carry emotional weight. When a language is tied to real people, real places, and meaningful moments, we remember it better, longer, and more vividly. This isn't just motivation, it's how memory works. First, emotion strengthens memory consolidation. Experiences that matter emotionally activate the brain's emotional and memory systems together, particularly the amygdala and the hippocampus, which make memories more durable and easier to retrieve. Language without emotional engagement simply doesn't get the same priority in long-term memory. Second, meaningful learning forces deeper processing. The brain processes meaning, not isolated words. This kind of semantic, conceptual processing is far more effective for long-term retention than memorization alone. Context becomes a powerful retrieval cue. If you have learned a phrase while navigating a city or solving a real-life problem, that solution becomes part of the memory itself. Later, the language comes back with the scene in your head attached, making recall faster and more reliable. And finally, this is why experience-based languages feel alive. They're stored less like textbook knowledge and more like autobiographical memory. Language embedded in identity, emotion, and lived experience. So when a strong language provides structure and meaningful experience provides emotional weight, learning multiple languages at once isn't just possible, it's one of the most powerful ways to make them last. Choose language combinations deliberately. Don't let multiple weak languages compete. Some people successfully study 3, 4, or even more languages at the same time. The issue is not the number of languages, it's how many of them are genuinely new. Cognitive research and long-term polyglot experience point to the same pattern. Confusion arises when several weak languages are competing for the same mental resources at once. When a language is still weak, grammar isn't automatic. Vocabulary retrieval is slow. Sounds and structures are not yet firmly represented. If too many languages are in this state simultaneously, their representations remain fuzzy and interfere with each other. But when most of your languages are already anchored, that situation changes. A strong or well-established language provides stable grammatical schemas, reliable phonological patterns, clear mental representations. New languages can attach to this structure instead of floating unattached. Similarity no longer causes confusion. It creates contrast. That is why studying Portuguese through Spanish works so well for me. Spanish wasn't competing with Portuguese. It was supporting it. So when choosing which languages to study together, limit how many are truly new at the same time. Let the established languages do the heavy lifting. And remember, similarity isn't the enemy. Unanchored learning is. Use an anchored language as an active learning tool. Once a language is anchored, it shouldn't just sit in the background. It should be used deliberately. Instead of learning a new language through your mother tongue, you use an anchored foreign language as your working reference. This changes how the brain processes the new language. Your native language is extremely efficient, often so efficient that learning can remain shallow. An anchored foreign language, by contrast, is strong enough to function but still require active attention. That slight effort forces deeper engagement with meaning. Instead of automatic translation, learning through an anchored language also encourages concept to concept mapping, not simple word-to-word substitution. You're no longer just translating into your native language. You're operating inside a multilingual system. When the languages are related, this approach becomes even more powerful. Similarities are noticed consciously. Differences stand out more clearly. The new language develops its own internal structure instead of blurring into the old one. This is exactly why studying Portuguese through Spanish works so well. Spanish wasn't competing with Portuguese, it was used to organize it. So the value of an anchored language isn't just that it prevents confusion, it's that it creates active processing, clearer structure, and stronger long-term retention. Build anchoring over time, and then let one language stabilize the next language. Anchoring doesn't happen all at once. It develops over time through repeated exposure, use, and increasingly complex input. A language becomes anchored when core grammar feels automatic. High-frequency vocabulary comes without searching. You can follow real speech at normal speed, and you are no longer translating every sentence consciously. That's when a language stops floating and starts functioning as a stable system. This gradual anchoring is what makes learning related languages easier, not harder. In my case, Serbo-Croatian was my first strong Slavic language. It gave me early access to Slavic grammar, shared vocabulary, and the logic of the case system. That made learning Russian far less mysterious. Many structures were already familiar, even when the forms were different. Then, after 2 years studying Slavic literature in Poland, Polish became my strongest Slavic anchor. At that point, I wasn't learning individual languages. I had internalized the system. Because of that, when I later spoke with Czechs, Slovaks, and Ukrainians for the first time, I could already understand a great deal and communicate immediately, even without having formally studied those languages. That's anchoring in action. So the strategy isn't to avoid related languages. It's to build anchors sequentially, letting each one stabilize the next until entire language families start to open up naturally. Give each anchored language a distinct functional role. Once you have more than one anchored language, the next step is not to treat them all the same way. Languages stay clearer and more stable when each one has a distinct functional role. One language might be your reading or academic language, another your conversational or social language, and even another the language you use for travel, interviews, or daily problem solving. This isn't just a personal preference. It aligns with how memory works. From a cognitive perspective, function creates context, and context is one of the strongest organizers of memory. When a language is consistently used for a particular purpose, the brain stores it together with that purpose. This reduces competition at retrieval time because each language is accessed through a different pathway. There's also a skill learning effect here. Reading, listening, speaking, and writing are partially independent skills. When a language specializes in one of them, its representations become stronger and more efficient instead of thinly spread across everything at once. This is why languages often feel clearer when they do different jobs. A language you mostly read is retrieved differently than one you mostly speak, even if the two are closely related. In my own experience, some languages become anchored through literature and academic study, while others become anchored through conversation, travel, and teaching. Because they weren't serving the same function, they didn't compete. They specialized. Problems arise when multiple languages are weak and are forced into the same role at the same time. That's when retrieval becomes noisy and interference shows up. So instead of asking, which language am I strongest in? A better question is, what do I use this language for? When languages have clear roles, they don't blur. They coexist and reinforce each other. Manage cognitive load realistically. Aim for durability, not speed. Learning multiple languages at once doesn't give you more mental capacity. Attention, working memory, and energy are limited resources. When you divide them across several languages, something predictable happens. Daily progress in each language slows. Retrieval feels less immediate. Short-term gains look smaller. It's how learning under load works. From a cognitive perspective, each language draws on working memory and attentional control. If the load is too high, learning becomes fragile. But when the load is kept just below overload, the brain is forced to revisit material, re-encode it, and consolidate it more thoroughly. This creates a different learning pattern. Instead of fast accumulation followed by forgetting, you get frequent reactivation, more spaced repetition, more varied contexts. All of these are known to strengthen long-term memory, even when progress feels slower day to day. This is why expectations matter. If you expect single language speed while studying multiple languages, frustration is guaranteed. If you expect and accept slower growth but stronger roots, the process suddenly makes sense. In my own experience, languages learned alongside often took longer to feel fluent, but they were also harder to lose, easier to revive, and more resilient over time. So the goal isn't maximum speed. The goal is manageable load and long-term stability. When cognitive load is realistic, learning multiple languages doesn't weaken them. It makes them stick. Differentiate learning modes. Reduce load without reducing exposure. One of the easiest ways to overload yourself when learning multiple languages is to use the same learning mode for all of them. If every language is studied with the same app, drilled with the same exercises, practiced at the same intensity, then they compete for the same cognitive resources. A far more effective strategy is to differentiate learning modes. For example, one language might be input heavy, listening, reading, passive exposure. Another might be output focus, such as conversations and interviews in that language. Another might be analytical, grammar, literature, more analysis. This isn't just a practical trick. It's grounded in how learning works. Different modes rely partly on independent cognitive systems. Listening, reading, speaking, and writing overlap, but they don't compete completely. By spreading languages across different modes, you reduce interference while keeping total exposure high. There's also a memory benefit. Varied input creates multiple encoding routes. A word you hear in one language, read in another, and use actively in a third in spoken language is less likely to interfere and more likely to stick. This is why many polyglots can manage several languages at once without burnout. They're not doing everything in every language. They're letting each language lean into a different mode at a given time. The mistake is thinking balance means doing the same thing everywhere. Balance actually comes from complementarity. When learning modes are differentiated, your brain works less and learns more. Separate times, spaces, materials. Let context do the organizing. When you're learning multiple languages, context becomes one of your most powerful allies. This isn't about superstition or study rituals. It's grounded in how memory works. Memory is context dependent. The brain stores information together with where, when, and how it was learned. In cognitive terms, consistent contexts become part of memory trace itself. So the brain retrieves language through context rather than having to choose between competing languages. That's why separating languages by the time of day you study, the physical location, posture, laying down, sitting up, activity, notebooks, folders, colors, or devices actually works. For example, one language in the morning, another in the evening. One language always at the desk, another on walks or commutes using earphones. One notebook or color scheme per language. There's nothing magical about morning versus evening or desk versus walking. What matters is consistency. When a language is repeatedly learned in the same kind of context, that context becomes part of memory itself. This is especially important when languages are similar or learned close together. Contextual separation gives the brain non-linguistic boundaries, reducing interference and lowering cognitive load. There's also a practical benefit. When the environment already signals which language is active, you don't waste mental energy deciding or switching. The context does that part of the work for you. Many experienced polyglots do this instinctively, not because it looks neat, but because it keeps languages cleanly separated while they are still stabilizing. This doesn't mean you can never mix context later. Once languages are well anchored, flexibility increases naturally. But during learning, letting time, space, and materials organize your languages is one of the simplest and the most reliable ways to keep them from colliding. Immersion is maximal context. Let real life do the work. At a certain point, the most powerful learning strategy isn't another method. It's immersion. Immersion is where everything you've heard so far comes together. When you live, travel, work, or interact in a language, the entire environment becomes the context. People, places, problems, emotions, daily routines. From a memory perspective, this is maximal support. Language is no longer stored as isolated knowledge. It's embedded in experience. Emotion strengthens consolidation. Context becomes the retrieval cue. Use creates anchoring. And just as importantly, immersion offloads cognitive work. You're no longer deciding when to study or which language to activate. Real life makes those kind of decisions for you. This is why immersion doesn't usually cause confusion, even with similar languages. Context separates them naturally. Different places, different people, different roles. A language used to solve real problems doesn't float. It anchors. That doesn't mean immersion has to be perfect or total. even partial immersion, regular conversations through the internet, travel, interviews, reading, or daily routines create the same effect over time. And this is why experience-based languages feel alive long after formal study fades. They're not just remembered, they are lived. So if there's one idea that ties everything in this video together, it's this. Languages last when they are part of your life. And when they are, learning more than one at a time isn't a problem. It's a system. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video. By the way, if you haven't subscribed, please do so now. Thank you. If you would like to know more about my experience over the past 5 decades, learning and using more than 30 languages around the globe, with adventures in 101 countries so far, then please visit my website, polyglotdreams.com. There you will find my memoir, A Life in 30 Languages, translated in various languages and integrated with audio and dual readers to offer a great way to improve your target languages.